zero on the VU meter was usually about 20 dB below clipping, below full scale, right? I mean, the way we used to make mixes that we were happy with, the level was much lower, the average level. So here, this is quite hot. So I would venture to say, if we leave this mix at this level, you're going to get a plenty hot record. There will be no problem in terms of the level ultimately that you're going to get in the final result.
But the mastering engineer needs some headroom to work with.
That's exactly right. There are a couple of ways of thinking about this idea of headroom. One way of thinking about it is, well, the mix sounds great, let's just turn it down a little bit. And if the mix truly sounds great, if you're totally happy with it, and you have metering that shows you what we're seeing here, then whether it's you or the mastering engineer that just pulls the output down, that final version to get some room to work, that's an option. I'm not saying it's the only option, nor is it always the right option. If you're saying, you know what, I think it sounds better if I give myself more room to work so it doesn't sound pinched. I, as a mastering engineer, would be very happy to have some more headroom above where the average level is sitting than what we have here.
Well, this particular project, the mixes were all the way up to the edge.
Yeah.
Then when it came to mastering, the mastering engineer had difficulty to keep it clear because the guitars were obscuring the vocals. Things got lost right away. I went back 3 times, bringing down the levels, just to get it to open up enough that when I got the mastering back, it made sense and it wasn't worse than the final mix. Understanding how far down I can bring the initial tracks is going to help me a lot with my future mixing. Now, this meter is really revealing, and I wanted to ask you, where do you have that? Is that post-ozone on the stereo bus?
Yes, in order for that meter to truly be useful, it needs to be the very last thing in the chain, because it'll show you the accumulated level through everything that you're doing, whether it's on the track level or the stem level or the 2-mix out. It's a complex system, the sort of gain staging through a mix, right? You've got your stems, your buses, right? Do you have anything on your buses?
Yes.
Something. So, one of the things you have to be aware of is that if you drop the level of the tracks, it's going to change the processing.
And I have to rebalance again.
So you have to do all of that again. And that pinch phenomenon, I think that you're alluding to, comes from pushing level into your tube bus processing, into the limit.
Really? Is that right?
Yeah, you probably would get some satisfaction if you drop the input into ozone. But still, anything that's happening upstream from that in terms of gain staging is still maybe going to be problematic.
Right.
So yeah, feel free to take the tracks down, give yourself plenty of room to work, and then you can add level later. It's really hard to take level away and undo some of the artifact and some of the things that you're hearing.
Right.
There's one other thing I wanted to point out. So you've got a limiter here that's your final stage. This is sitting on your 2-mix output.
Yeah.
And then the ceiling is sitting at 0. I've always encouraged people at every stage to leave a little bit of margin coming out of their final stage. Turning this down is very much like turning this down.
Oh.
It's really the same thing, but it gives you a little bit of room here so you won't get levels that peak above 0 dBFS. You won't hear distortion on the output. If you let this sit at 0, there's every possibility that on the analog side, what we're hearing actually will exceed 0 and it'll sound a little bit clipped. So whatever your final stage is, go ahead and cheat that down just a little bit, give yourself a little bit of room. It'll make mastering engineers happier too.
Can we take a listen to that effect?
Sure.
Actually.
Anything more than a dB or 2 is not going to help, again, the pinched thing that happens because of the gain staging into the limiter. But it's always a good habit or a good practice to leave a little bit of margin at the very top for when you print your file.
Is that going to create pinching? The pinching?
Turning it down?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Absolutely not. It's just a function of level. If anything, it should make your peaks sound cleaner and better and clearer. A lot of people are having to kind of master their own stuff. So people start thinking about mixing and mastering at the same time. And so I just wanted to get your take and your approach to that issue.
when I start on a project, from day one of recording, I'm always thinking of what it is going to be when it's mixed and ultimately mastered. So I make placements in monitoring, while we're recording. I'm combining things, I'm placing them in the panning. I'm doing an EQ on the way to the recorder so that I don't have to make these decisions later. And ultimately, those things are meant to make mixing easier. So it's already thought out when I go to mix. The trick that I found is to get an approval from a client. That mix has to sound competitive with what's on the radio, which has already been mastered. So I'm always going to do some pre-mastering just to get the client happy and excited so we can really actually understand what it'll sound like. So I want to start right away with understanding where the mix is going to be and then ultimately the mastering. Once I get an approval, then I'll strip off the stereo bus compression. I'll use it for the approval and then I'll take it right off before I send it to mastering.
Talk to me about your relationship with mastering.
I just don't want them to screw it up. When I send them without processing, without stereo bus processing, I also send them the reference, the final approved mix with the processing so that they can have a reference. This is what the client approved. Please, if you're going to do anything, make it sound a little better than that. If you're going to do anything, just don't make it sound worse. What do you think the job of a mastering engineer is? The title is engineer. Does that mean that they're being creative with what they do?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. Use the word creative. I think you have to tread gently with that. Sometimes creativity in mastering, to me, maybe the gentle addition of color that might come in some cases, fairly transparent transformers, very rarely tape sort of treatments or something like that can benefit a mix, but only a little bit. And if you go too far, you change a lot about the way a mix is put together. You can change the balance and you can change the tone. I think the responsibility is to sort of notice what you notice about what's going on in a mix. If you have any questions, communicate with the mix engineer and say, did you really mean the penny whistle to be 30 dB louder than the vocal? Or, whatever the thing is. And if they say yes, you have to figure out a way to make that work. It's not your job to know what's right. It's your job to make the observations and then to help. I think the key word is sort of, words, respect, and a little goes a long way.
I find it amazing to see what a mastering engineer can do to broaden the width of a mix, but that often is at the expense of certain levels of things that you've placed in the mix. When I get a mix back for mastering and I'm listening to it, and now it's wider, it's airier, it's cleaner, but my lead vocal is buried behind the freshly exposed guitar parts. So what do? Well, I have to go back in and I'll make a vocal version. Or anything that's obscured by this new finishing EQ, if I like it, I'll make adjustments to my final mix and send a revision over to the mastering engineer so he can remaster using the same settings. We'll just be able to hear those parts better.
That's very cool. So you hear something that's revealed in mastering that you do like.
Yeah.
And you sort of want to work towards that goal.
Right.
Cool.
I used to work with Prince, and he would record in a way that made me uncomfortable because he was pushing the levels on the tape so hard that if the monitors weren't up in the room, you could hear on the tape machines the rattle of the needles because they were all pegging and there was a sound to that. If you listen to those Revolution records and anything that he recorded, and he did all the recording mainly himself, they had a sound. It was smashed and really in your face. So I love that. 100 tracks together and you've got this crushing mess.
That's my favorite genre.
Now, when I start a mix, I take every track before I even begin and bring all the levels down, whether it's something that I recorded or if it's something that was sent to me to mix.
That looks to me like what I would hope for from a mix engineer. There's a little bit of a margin at the top. There's a little bit of room to push level if it needs to be pushed. But there's also enough average level that it's not going to be it's not going to be up to mastering to make the record sound like it needs to sound.
Okay.
That looks perfect. There's something else that we noticed that was really interesting about this record. If we pull up tonal balance control, which is this tool that's designed to give you a sense of what is, I hate to use the word typical or common because that just sounds really uninteresting. It's like, I want to make a common record or a typical record. Every record, of course, is supposed to sound great and compelling and interesting and beautiful. But if you look at the display, you see a range, what we like to call tonal balance, right? Low end to mid-range to top end, the average distribution of energy across thousands and thousands of records.
So there's this machine learning that's evaluated on
That's right.
thousands of records.
Correct. But it doesn't mean that this is the final answer, nor does it mean that you have to make a straight line image of, in this display in order to have a good record. So when we hit play and let this settle down for a moment, you can see, and this is a fairly aggressive record.
Yes.
So you might expect to see the bottom and the upper mid-range being a little bit more emphasized.
Right.
And in fact, it's still
pretty obvious here, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's still kind of within bounds. It's not like anything so whacked that you'd have to go back and, and revisit your decisions.
Right.
Or else you blow up a car like that, right?
Well, that illustrates the that I pulled out of this genre of music because it's a harder, heavier genre and it's kind of scoop.
Actually, that's right. So if we take a look at the you can actually see that right there.
Yeah.
This influence.
How about that?
That
is an amazing tool.
You and I had the luxury of honing our craft in very specific parts of the music workflow. Not everybody has the luxury of doing that. Some people know themselves. If you're talking to somebody who wants, for instance, to master their own mixes, do you have any advice that you would give them?
I wouldn't push anyone away from doing that, actually, because you can get so much out of just taking your mix and A-Bing it with someone else's work and really dissect what is the difference, what makes it sound good, what is the ultimate shape of that successful mastering. And you can do that yourself just with a few tools. iZotope has a great suite for mastering. So I would suggest everyone try it at least.
Sylvia, thank you so much for spending this time. And I want to invite everybody, we've got a bunch of learning assets on the iZotope website. We've got blogs, we've got videos. We recently published a series called Are You Listening, where you can learn some more specifically about mastering. We've got mixing videos and Pro Audio Essentials and other things. So please visit the site, and I really appreciate your desire to keep learning.
Absolutely.
Welcome to another episode of Are You Listening? Today we're going to talk a little bit about how you listen, what you listen to, and your environment. Please look at the iZotope website to find companion blogs, videos, other educational materials. And today I want to spend a little time talking about your environment and how to set up and strategies for setting up, because ultimately what you hear is what matters most. So we're looking to develop our brains and tune our brains to what the stimulus is, right? What you're listening to, which means you've got to pay attention to the setup. So I'm going to call this next section, You Can't Hear the Truth Through Rose-Colored Glasses. I'm mixing metaphors here, right? But you kind of get the point. If there's something about your listening environment that either enhances what you hear in a way that somehow hides the truth. Welcome to another episode of Are You Listening? Today we're going to talk a little bit about how you listen, what you listen to, and your environment. Please look at the iZotope website to find companion blogs, videos, other educational materials. And today I want to spend a little time talking about your environment and how to set it up and some strategies for setting it up, because ultimately what you hear is what matters most. So we're looking to develop our brains and tune our brains to what the stimulus is, right? What you're listening to, which means we've got to pay attention to the setup. So we're going to call this next section. Hello, my name is Jonathan Weiner. I'm here in the critical listening room at Isotope in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome to season 2 of Are You Listening? Before I launch in, a couple of reminders. If you're interested in this video and other videos like it, click the subscribe thing down at the bottom of the screen below this image, sort of down there, and you'll be notified when new episodes come out. Please feel free to go to isotope.com and have a look at other videos that we have there, blogs, articles about artists, Pro Audio Essentials. There's an ear training tool that we make to level up your skills. There's lots and lots of interesting things to do there. And of course, you can download Ozone and follow along with this episode. Today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about width in the context of mastering. So let's get started. So when we talk about width, what are we talking about? Before we even dive into some of the subtleties and nuances in mastering, I think it's worthwhile to remind ourselves that the environment within which we make decisions about our mixing and mastering, just what we're hearing, depends so much on our playback system. There's some basic principles, some basic ideas that you can use. If you're listening in headphones, obviously there's not a whole lot you can do about adjusting the stereo width of what you hear. But if you are listening in speakers, which is recommended at least some of the time in your work, it's a good idea to observe the equilateral triangle idea, where the position of your head is equidistant from each speaker and the speakers are equidistant from each other. This will put you in a position to have the best shot of having an even distribution of energy across the stereo field. If you hear anything when you're listening routinely that comes out of the stereo field, in other words, you think you're hearing sounds coming from outside of the left speaker or outside of the right speaker, you might want to think about what's happening in terms of reflected surfaces in your room, which can color the sound and also cause you to make some less than ideal decisions regarding stereo width. When we think about width in mastering, we are thinking about it much of the same way that you think about width in mixing. Where do you place the instruments in your mix? And the decisions that you make in mixing are going to have a lot of play in the decisions that we make in mastering. When we think about width, I mean, there's sort of a neat aspect to panning things around, creating a sense of depth and reverb, putting accompanying instruments on the left side and the right side. So that's part of what goes into creating a sense of space in the mix. And when we start thinking about adjusting width and mastering, we have to think about what those decisions were in the mix, which will, to some extent, determine what we end up doing in mastering. If you want to understand the way people use stereo width in mastering, you can do what's called an A-V technique in listening to some of your favorite tracks. Let me show you how to do that. And so I've got a session here with Ozone instantiated, and I am going to put the equalizer into mid-side mode so that we can monitor just the side channel. What that allows you to do is to hear anything that's been panned off center. In some cases, you'll hear very clearly that certain instruments have been panned very wide left and right. It's not atypical to hear a percussion instrument or a guitar or a keyboard or sometimes background vocals panned off to the side. So listen to this track for a moment, and I'll give you a demonstration of that. So here's the whole track. And this is just the panned information. Back to the whole track. And now this is the information that's not panned, or what we like to call mono. So it's interesting when we do this to discover that the important elements in our mix, by and large, are panned to the center. Now, this is an interesting example because the vocals are somewhat spread out. We have background vocals that are very strong, panned to the left side and the right side. But the kick drum, the snare drum, and the bass are all dead up center. And when I soloed the side channel, or the panned information, you didn't hear any bass. I'll come back to this concept in a little while when we talk about the idea of stereo bass or monoizing the bass. But for the moment, suffice it to say that just by understanding what's in the middle and what's in the side, that will help us understand what we're doing when we start changing the sense of stereo width or the balance between the mono signal and the side signal. When we're making decisions about whether or not to do any kind of width adjustment to a mix, then you have to ask yourself, why am I doing it? What do I hope to achieve from it? Remember, if we hear instruments that are panned wide and we start to increase the signal in the stereo width, those instruments are going to come up in the balance, which may be cool and interesting and even exciting. If we have a lot of reverb and we bring up the side information, we may get a greater sense of spaciousness and reverb in the mix. But there's a flip side to this decision that you're going to make, which is that if all of the important instruments, at least in terms of a rhythm section, are panned right up the middle, and we increase the sense of width around the stereo image, are we going to lose the focus on the center, on the groove? So every time you make an adjustment, you want to make sure, at least for a moment, to pay attention to what's happening with the clear, focused center of your stereo image. One of the things that you hear people talk about a great deal is, should I center my bass? Should I mono the bass? And there are many ways of doing this. Many products include monoizing functions. You can certainly do this in Ozone by using the stereo width tool. Let me show you how. In the stereo imager, I can create a crossover so that I'm focusing the effect of the imager just on the bass region. I'm going to solo the bass region so you can hear what I'm talking about. So right now we're listening to only energy below about 110 hertz. Okay, so you hear the kick drum, you hear the bass. If I take the stereo width slider and move it all the way to the bottom, I've created a low end that's entirely mono. And if you look at the vectorscope over here on the right side, you can see the orientation of it is straight up and down. If I return the slider back to 0, you can see that there's an orientation that's slightly less, or slightly more diffuse, slightly less up and down, and it includes a little side to side or phase different information between the two channels. So you'll notice when I was playing that example that there certainly is a difference when we take the low end region and sum it to mono or restore it back to its original orientation. But you'll also notice that in the side channel, there was no kick drum and there was no bass, which leads to the question, when I mono the bass, what am I doing? You're not actually monoizing the bass. And if you were to look at common examples of pop mixes or your favorite mixes in most genres that include drums and bass, you'll discover that the mono contains all of the kick drum and all of the bass energy. So monoing the bass isn't really going to help tighten the bass. It's not really going to help bring those elements more into focus because they're already incredibly well focused. They are panned right up the center. What is going to happen is you're going to take the low frequency energy that's contained in accompanying instruments like guitars, keyboards, pads, even perhaps male vocals or background vocals that have lower pitches to them. And those are going to be brought into the center. That may or may not be a good thing. In doing so, you're going to lose a little bit of a sense of depth and space in the low mid range, and you're going to gain a little bit more clarity because we've taken some of that low energy out of the side or the difference channel and brought it into the center. So it's important to understand what you're doing and to think about why you're doing it before you engage in monoizing the bass. When I'm thinking about adjusting the stereo width, I have to think about where I position the adjustment that I'm making. Do I want to do something to the stereo width at the beginning of my mastering chain or at the end of my mastering chain? My take on this, and I think this applies to other tools as well, EQ and compression and so on, is if there's something I need to do to correct the stereo image, in other words, if it just feels too narrow, I'm going to make the correction first before I do any other signal processing. Because when you think about sequencing modules, there's a dependency when you go from the first to the second to the third. The level will affect the compressor. What you do with the compressor will change your decisions about an EQ that's next and so on. So I want to make sure that I do all of my correction up front. If everything seems pretty good, but I think, gee, it might be kind of cool to create a little bit more stereo width, a little bit more energy out on the sides, I might leave that until my very last or next to last module, just before I get to the limiter. So my decision about where to place the image processing is dependent on that decision, on that criteria. Coming back to the idea of stereo width and balance. So let's go back and think a little bit about what kinds of instruments are panned, what kinds of instruments show up most often in the stereo image, and what making adjustments in the stereo image or to the stereo image are going to do to the recording. Starting with the kinds of instruments that are most commonly panned off of center, they tend to be tonal instruments that carry harmony, that are complementary to the featured instrument, like guitar, like a keyboard, like a pad. And then we have percussion instruments like hi-hats, shakers, anything that's sort of the ear candy that we use to define the edges of the stereo field. Thinking about the mix this way will lead us to think a little bit harder about what we do in mastering when we adjust stereo image. If we bring up the side information in, say, the mid-range frequency bands between 500 and 2000 hertz, chances are we are going to be changing the balance between those guitars and pads and whatever is penned in the center, the rhythm section and possibly a lead instrument, lead vocal. So if you bring those up too much, they're going to create some competition for the listener between those elements. So the question is that good? Is that what we want to do? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe the answer is no, but we tend to be a little bit more careful about raising the uncorrelated or side information in the middle of the frequency spectrum. The same is also true with high frequency information like percussion and hi-hats. If we boost the high end of the side information, we're going to bring that forward. But that information, that's musical signal, is generally speaking less competitive with the vocal and with the drums and with the bass. And so, at least in my experience, I find you can be a little bit more aggressive isn't the right word. You can make bigger changes to the high end of the uncorrelated or the side signal. So if we take a look at ozone, you'll see we can split the bands and think about making changes to each band according to the nature of the signals that live within the band. So first, let's listen to each one of these bands that I've created. I'll set one crossover at about 500 hertz and set one at about 2000 hertz. So this is all the low frequency information. Here we have the body of most of the vocals and the snare drum. And here we have the percussion and the high end of the reverbs and some of that ear candy that I was talking about. So when I'm making decisions about how much to widen a track, I might make different decisions in each band. I might decide to add a little bit of stereo width in the mid-range, but not so much that I cause some of that competition that I was referring to before. And I might add a little bit more to the high frequency information. I could even add a fourth band and go a little bit further with the really ultra high, even the high end with the hi-hat is missing most of the body of the hi-hat, for instance. And so the result will sound something like this. I'll start with it bypassed and then we'll add it. I am the stars in the transformation, 24/7 in the celebration. I know what I want to chase you around. Offering my mind in an operation, open heart century of purification. Tell me what I gotta do to keep you around. But when you focus on so even with this example, I think you'll notice if you go back and listen to it again, that when I turn on the imager, where I'm creating a sense of width, we're getting some excitement in the high end. Everything feels a little bit wider and a little bit broader, but the warmth of the lead vocal has been pushed back a little bit as a result. So there's a trade-off there, and we have to manage that trade-off as we're navigating the decisions about how wide to make a track. There are other tools that we can use to enhance stereo width. Thus far, I've been using the imager, which is a mid-side tool, to adjust the difference between mono and everything that's panned. Many modules allow you to go into mid-side mode in Ozone. You can do so in the equalizer, put it in mid-side mode, and only enhance the high frequency energy on the sides, for instance. You can adjust the mid versus side in the compressor module. Some modules don't let you go in mid-side mode, like the tape module. That just wouldn't really make much sense. It would create such a weird difference between the mono and the side that it would probably produce a bad result. If you look at the imager module, you'll see that there are 4 different ways of viewing the stereo image, of metering the stereo image. The 3 that you see here, the polar sample, polar level, and to some extent lyssageous or lyssageuse, depending on where you're from, displays, let you see the information slightly differently. Let me But they all let you see pretty much the same thing. They let you see the difference between the mono component of the signal, or the in phase between 2 channels, and the out of phase version. The more you have a vertical orientation, the stronger the mono component, and the more you see the horizontal orientation, you'll see a vertical component. When you're looking at your mix, if you see persistently, if you see a stronger horizontal component compared to the vertical component, you may want to step back and think about, do I have too much information panned, or should I bring up my rhythm section? It's not always the case, but that can be a visual clue to lead you to investigate this relationship. So I'll play a little bit of the track, and I think you'll notice that when the drums are in, you see, and every strong beat, you see a strong vertical kick, if you will. And when the vocals come in, you see the whole image pull out wide, left and right, because the vocals are widely panned in this track. I am the stars in the transformation, 24/7 in the celebration. I know what I want to chase you around. Offering my mind in an operation, open heart century of purification. So as you watch this display, you'll also notice that there is nothing that's exclusively panned all the way to the left or all the way to the right, at least nothing that's very high in amplitude, so it's pulling the entire stereo image out to the sides. The meter to the right is also interesting to talk about for a moment. There are 3 positions, or 3 compass points. on this meter. There's 0, which represents a completely diffuse phase orientation. In other words, not in phase, not out of phase, just equal energy across left, right, and center. If you have a purely mono signal, you'll see this meter go all the way up to the top. In fact, let me put the signal into mono, and you'll see what that looks like. So now I've soloed just the mono, and you see that we have no phase disparate information compared to stereo. If you look at this correlation meter, when I solo just the side channel as opposed to the center, you'll see that the indicator is pulled all the way down to fully phase incoherent. In other words, we have nothing in phase in what we're hearing. If you are mixing and you're listening to your full stereo mix and you ever see this meter trending strongly towards -1 or towards that position, that's an indication that you might be creating a problem for the listener. What kind of problem, you say? Well, let me solo the side channel and say that your mix is being listened to in mono. Somebody's listening on their phone, they've got a low bandwidth feed from whatever their favorite streaming service is, and it's being collapsed to mono. Watch what happens. The music disappears. That's probably not what you intend. So, it's a good reason to pay attention to your correlation meter while you're mixing. I can't emphasize enough that what we're doing is making art or engaging at least in creative activity. And it's important for us to be able to engage in artistic and sonic adventures and try things and see what works and doesn't work. My intention is to give you some guidelines and ways to think about managing the mono versus stereo. And I think that all of these tips are relatable to sort of common decisions that we make in the context of music production. But that doesn't mean that you can't try things. You can try panning the kick drum to one side and panning the bass to the other side. You can try taking the low end and widening it in a mastering context and see what happens. The two things you always want to keep in mind is your listener. Is the listener going to hear what you want them to hear? And one way to ensure that is to check your mixes in mono, especially if you start playing in this sandbox of stereo imaging. When you go to mono, if you notice that your important instruments either disappear or vary wildly in terms of the level in the mix, that's a time to go back and think about, can I be a little bit more strategic in making these decisions? Could I pan a little less extremely, or maybe I can create a sense of stereo image or stereo depth doing something else. But I want to encourage you all to happily pursue whatever wacky creative ideas you may be coming up with, because sometimes those are the coolest. I'll give you just a quick example of where I think stereo image adventures have been problematic for me. Way back, there was a band called the Beatles. They made some records in the 1960s just when stereo was invented. And in order to sell stereo, the record labels thought it would be really cool to have mixes that demonstrated the power of stereo. So they wanted something that wasn't so subtle. What if we put the lead vocal and the drums over here and the bass and the main guitar over here, just to demonstrate the power of having two speakers as opposed to one? I remember finding this problematic when I was working out in the gym. Some 30 years ago, it was a big, wide, open space, and they had a playback system that was arranged in stereo. And when I was working on my legs, over on one end of the gym, all I could hear was John Lennon's voice and a bass guitar. I was missing half the music. And then when I went over to the other side of the gym, it was Paul and the rest of the instruments. So that's just a way of illustrating this idea of keeping the listener in mind and making sure that no matter what you do, that the people who are listening to your music will get the heart of your musical idea. Another thing to consider is when you decorrelate a musical signal, you will make it softer. Okay, why is that, you may say? Because there's an efficiency, there's a power that comes from two speakers doing the same thing at the same time. If you take the kick drum and pan it all the way to one speaker, well, a pan in a mixing engine will compensate for the loss of level between the two channels. You still arrive at a point where you only have one speaker doing something in the low end and not the other. When they're both doing the same thing at the same time, there's more sound pressure level, there's more energy, there's more level, there's more loudness for the listener. So there's also a cautionary note that if you spread out the image too much, you might have to do other things to make your record sound loud enough or impactful enough for the listener. As far as artistic adventures go, you may find it interesting to click the link here and listen to the playlist that I've put together of interesting adventures in stereo imaging in some recordings. Some of them are a little bit more conventional, some of them are a little bit wackier. But they're all interesting and fun to listen to, and maybe they'll stimulate some creativity for you. So thank you so much for listening to this episode and watching this episode of Are You Listening? And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.